All right, everybody all right today? Last time we were starting to be more specific about the creationists, and to kind of sum up a little bit of what I did last time, I'm trying to make the case, which numbers and a number of our authors make, that there is a real difference between what today is called scientific creationism, which is now in the newspapers and has been in the courts for the last decade, or 2 decades, and the original reaction to Darwinism by creationists who cannot be labeled scientific creationists in the more modern sense. Scientific creationism in the more modern sense, the one that's making the newspaper, the one that has written laws for Arkansas and Louisiana, the one that most people identify with fundamentalism and evangelicalism, is really a very recent development. In fact, it is a revival that began in the 60s, in the 1960s. So it started developing at the same time I was getting my education, my college education, and yet the seeming view of a lot of people nowadays is that this is the same old thing, and that's unfortunate. It's unfortunate for some fundamentalists, for instance, who made a great deal more progress in accepting particularly geology, and many made a great deal of progress in accepting modern biology, and that Henry Morris and his group, based on a movement that had begun by Mccready Price in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, actually represents a kind of a retrogressive movement. And that's what I want to emphasize, and I want to do a little bit more this morning on the creationists and their predecessors. And you'll know that this book, God and Nature, Historical Essays on the Encounter Between Christianity and Science, contains an article by Ronald Numbers on the creationists. The creationists. So before you listen to this course or this subject, you should have read that article. After you've listened to this subject, you should read it again, because everything will come a little bit better into focus. The creationists. Now, I've already indicated that after Darwin presented his theory of evolution, there was an immediate reaction on the part of creationists. But these creationists were not what we today call scientific creationists. These creationists were the scientists of his day. We're talking about people who were the geologists, who were the biologists, the botanists of his day, the members of the Royal Society. They were just as shocked as any preacher was by the theory of evolution as Darwin presented it. They had already heard of such attempts before, and from their perspective, the geological record, the fossil record, simply would not sustain a Darwinian thesis. And so they weren't objecting to it primarily on biblical grounds, though most of them were Christians and believed the Bible. They had already adjusted the Bible to eons of geological time. But they couldn't find it in themselves to accept, at least at first glance, Darwin's theory of his theory of the origin of the species. Because from their perspective, the fossil record clearly indicated that there were jumps that occurred throughout the geological history. These jumps may have been hundreds of thousands of years ago or even longer. They just were waiting for evidence as to how long it was. But from their perspective, something appeared in the geological or the fossil record, and it continued in a equilibrium for a long time, and then in some cases it disappeared, went out of existence, and something else appears. But something else appears without, at least in the fossil records from their perspective, any transitional forms. And so they still, with all of the information they had available to them, still could not bring themselves to give up the idea that there was some kind of special creation that took place in the past. It may have been long before 6000 BC, but still some special creation took place in the past. Now, some of them were open possibly to the idea that there may have even been some changes in species, because certainly they believed that it's possible that new species had developed over that period of time. But they still believed that there were initial forms, what the Bible called kinds, though they didn't argue necessarily from the Bible. What the Bible called kinds, they were arguing from the fossil record. What the Bible called kinds may have been created by God, and then everything that has subsequently developed had developed from those kinds. But they were especially sensitive about the human being, because the human being was viewed as having an immortal soul and being made in the image of God, so they could not bring themselves to believe that an ape had been an ancestor. Any ape-like creature had been an ancestor of human beings. They believed that apes and human beings were very close together in terms of their physical nature, but they believed that that could be accounted for by creation as well as it could be accounted for by any theory of evolution. So the first responders to Darwin were not people like Henry Morris. They were the scientists of their period. And those that continued to respond negatively to Darwin were also responding, that is, the intellectuals and the scientists were responding on the basis of the fact that they were still committed to the scientific methodology of Francis Bacon. And in Francis Bacon's scientific methodology, there was no room for the kind of hypothesizing and theorizing that Darwin had. So there had to be a change, as Kuhn says, there had to be a change in paradigm before even the scientists of Darwin's day could accept his view. And sometimes a change in paradigm, as they say, requires several high-class funerals, if you understand what I'm saying. Because older scientists, who were around when Newton presented his thesis, many of them died before they would accept it. The same thing is true with Copernicus. The same thing is true with Einstein. And there are still alternative views to almost any scientific theory that has been proposed. There has developed an orthodoxy around each of these new developments. But there always remain people who are skeptical and who are working at trying to disprove these theories. And most scientists accept that as a legitimate part of science. They consider it legitimate for somebody to work very hard to try to disprove a theory, because otherwise these theories are not tested or tried. But it soon became scientific, Darwin's theory of evolution, or at least a theory of evolution, soon became kind of scientific orthodoxy. But even a great many of the people for whom evolution became scientific orthodoxy still had problems with Darwin's theory of natural selection. So that debate is still going on. So again, the debate that's now going on in the courts and in the newspapers and in the school system is a recent thing that is related to what went on right after Darwin did his thing, but it's not the same thing. Many of the fundamentalists, many of the people who were called fundamentalists, the proto-fundamentalists, like the professors at Princeton and Yale and officials in the Presbyterian Church, were very interested in fighting some of the modernist ideas that had developed. And evolution was just one of these problems for them. Their main problem had to do with the evolutionary view of the nature of man. but also the evolutionary view, how the evolutionary view affected the interpretation of the Bible, or even the concept of what the Bible was. Was the Bible simply the result of a long evolutionary religious development? Or did the Bible, could Christians still, even with modern science, believe that somehow or another God had invaded history, invaded time to reveal himself, and that the Bible was the record of that revelation? Some of these people believed in a strict doctrine of inerrancy and some didn't. Some were fundamentalists, some were liberals, but a great many people, both fundamentalist and liberal, still believed in the possibility of revelation. And so some of the conclusions that some of the evolutionists had come to that were purely naturalistic philosophically really got a response, not just from fundamentalists, but from liberal Christians who believed that even if evolution took place, a Christian cannot accept evolution as purely a naturalistic, materialistic process. That somehow or another he can accept this much evolution or he can accept the whole thing, but he cannot accept the idea that the whole thing has nothing to do with God, or God has nothing to do with the whole thing. So that was really what was going on in the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. And I've already indicated that some people who were called fundamentalists, for instance like George Frederick Wright, who was one of the world's best known geologists at the time, originally accepted a fairly thorough Darwinian position. He kind of backed off from that a little bit as he went along because he saw the naturalistic implications of some of Darwinian theory. But at the same time, he never became a Henry Morris type creationist. And he was the one chosen to write the article on evolution in the series of books called The Fundamentals. And I indicated to you last time through this chart that I'm going to put back down here that there were two fundamentalist interpretations of creation and its relation to science that were in existence for decades before the present scientific creationism developed. And that included the gap or ruin and restoration theory. That is, that the Bible says in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void. Well, what does that do? That leaves you with an opening right there in the first verse of the Bible for as many millions of years as you want of pre-creation, of pre-Genesis activity, pre-Adamic activity. So these fundamentalists even talked about a pre-Adamic race. And so from their perspective, when people are out in Africa digging up bones of things that look humanoid, what they're dealing with is the pre-Adamic race, and there is no revelation in the Bible about them. They're just the hint that there might be them, but there's no revelation in the Bible about them. So that does not concern us from their perspective as religious people or as theologians, because the only thing that concerns us is what the Bible is revealing. And the Bible is revealing to the Adamic race. It's not revealing to any pre-Adamic races. We don't know, they would say, what God's relationship to those people were. We don't know what God's relationship to the dinosaurs were. But there are plenty of millions of years in which all of that could take place before the drama begins in the Bible. That is the gap theory or the ruin and restoration theory. And in that period of millions of years, there could be all kinds of demises of various species and kinds of animals, and even whole families of animals, and even a pre-Adamic race of human beings, of human-type beings. Well, that doesn't sound much like what Henry Morris is saying, and it's not much like that, but that was the view, for instance, of C.I. Scofield, who was the most influential fundamentalist in the early part of the 20th century because it was the Scofield Bible that fundamentalists used. So the 6 days of Genesis, according to the gap theories, the ruin and restoration theory, the 6 days of Genesis took place about 4004 BC or somewhere thereabout. But the original creation of the world, who knows? All right, then there's another way in which science is related to the Bible among fundamentalists and some more liberal Christians. That's the day-age theory. And that's the one that probably most Americans who still believe in creation, most Americans say, well, it doesn't have to be 24-hour days. It could be, each day could represent eons. And so what you have here is discussion or the description of 6 geological eons, which could have been an indeterminate number of years. And that's the view probably that a large number of fundamentalists, and certainly almost all liberal evangelicals around the turn of the century. Now for these first two, Noah's flood didn't enter very much into the discussion, because for them Noah's flood could be universal or it could be local. But Noah's flood is not needed to explain all of the geological and fossil evidence. In Henry Morris's view, the Genesis flood is what explains all the geological and fossil evidence. So what we need to do is find out how this view eventually triumphed, at least in the popular mind, over the earlier fundamentalist views. And in order to do that, we have to go back to a man named William Jennings Bryan and a man named Mccready Price. If you'll notice on this, if you look again at this this chart, there are names out to the side of each of these ways of looking at it. The first one, that is the day-age theory, was the one accepted by George Frederick Wright, who was the one who wrote in the Fundamentals. He was a day-age theorist. So was William Jennings Bryan. He was a day-age theorist. I told you the problem he had at the Scopes monkey trial, because he was expected to defend George Mccready Price's view, which is the third one. And he wasn't willing to defend that view because he was a day-age person. So he said he wasn't concerned about the age of rocks. He was primarily concerned about the impact of any theory of evolution on the nature of the human being and therefore on the nature of society. He was a populist Democrat who was concerned because he believed, for instance, that the German imperialism of World War II had been caused by Darwinism. Now, the relationship of Darwinism to German imperialism in World War I, I'm sorry. The German imperialism of World War I, the relationship of Darwinism to that is a very complex issue. But there is some relationship. There certainly is some relationship between Darwinism in the form of German evolutionary thought on World War II. And so that's what Bryan's primary concern was with what's sometimes called social Darwinism, or sometimes not called social Darwinism, but it amounts to the same thing or something worse. So George Frederick Wright, William Jennings Bryan were in the day-age category. In the gap and restoration category included Harry Rimmer, who was one of the important fundamentalists of the early period, C.I. Scofield, who produced the Scofield Bible, L.A. Higley, and guess who? Jimmy Swaggart. In other words, Jimmy Swaggart is one of the best-known fundamentalist ministers of the 20th century, and he was not a follower of Henry Morris. He believed in the ruin gap theory, and there are a large number of fundamentalists and Pentecostals who still believe in the ruin gap theory. So, why is the flood geology theory, or the scientific creationist theory, so prominent now in the news? Where did it come from? George Mccready Price was a Seventh-day Adventist. He did not have a college degree. He was not a geologist, but he fancied himself a geologist. And he was afraid of the same thing William Jennings Bryan was afraid of, except that he had an influence which William Jennings Bryan did not have. That was the influence of Ellen G. White. Now, does anybody know who Ellen G. White was? Ellen G. White was the prophetess of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Basically, the Seventh-day Adventist Church was founded by a woman prophet named Ellen G. White. Now, not all Adventists were Seventh-day Adventists. Adventism was a movement that began in the 19th century, in fact, the early part of the 19th century, that was looking forward to the end of the world. And they thought the end of the world was going to take place in the 19th century. It didn't. But that didn't destroy all Adventism. Adventism still survived, and it still survives today. And one of those branches that survived was an Adventism which also practiced the observance of the seventh day, or the Sabbath day. If you want some modern connection, David Koresh was raised in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. He, of course, became part of a sect movement that's even more extreme than the Seventh-day Adventists. I shouldn't say even more extreme, certainly more extreme than the Seventh-day Adventists. But his basic theology and his basic biblical interpretation comes from Seventh-day Adventism. And Ellen G. White influenced the Henry Morris movement because she got a revelation from God. William Jennings Bryan never claimed a revelation from God. Even when he talked about the Bible, he talked about the revelation of God coming through the Bible. So from his perspective, in order to find out the revelation of God, you had to study the Bible, and you had to study it correctly. You had to use the proper hermeneutical tools and so forth. Well, Ellen G. White was not confined by such hermeneutic because she had a direct contact with God, and God spoke to her in visions and gave her information. And one of the visions she had gave her the following information. The flood explains all geological and fossil strata. Well, if God tells you that, then what is your next step? Well, Ellen G. White was not a scientist. She just had the presupposition for a new scientific theory. And that presupposition was that the flood explains all geological strata and fossil evidence. And so George Mccready Price picked up on that as a loyal Seventh-day Adventist. And he began to do lots of reading. He was an intelligent man, though he wasn't an educated man. He did lots of reading, and he started producing books making fun of Darwin's theory of evolution and declaring it to be anti-Christian and anti-biblical. Well, other fundamentalists not only were not influenced by Ellen G. White, but there was a very strained relationship in the first part of the 20th century between Seventh-day Adventists and other fundamentalists. Because Seventh-day Adventists were usually classified, if fundamentalists and evangelicals in the 20th century classified people, they would classify a number of denominations as evangelical, but they would classify Christian Science, the Mormons, and Seventh-day Adventists as what? As cults. In other words, that's when we started using the word cult in a pejorative sense. And so there was not much communication in the first part of the century between Seventh-day Adventists and Presbyterians and Baptists, who produced most of the fundamentalists. But George Mccready Price was a good writer. He's an interesting writer. I have some of his original texts, and he makes interesting and humorous points that, if you don't know anything about science, would be welcomed as a legitimate critique of science. And so he became fairly well known. When William Jennings Bryan was called in or volunteered to be part of the prosecution of the Scopes trial, he wanted George Mccready Price to come down and be a witness. But George Mccready Price refused to do so. Not only did George Mccready Price refuse to do so, but several other people refused to do so. Some of them refused to do so because even though they were fundamentalists and Bryan expected support from them, they were not interested in prosecuting Scopes. And they believed that William Jennings Bryan was getting himself into all kinds of trouble by doing this because he was stifling freedom of expression, which a great many fundamentalists were in favor of. And he was also getting involved in science, and he was not a scientist. So there were a great many fairly moderate fundamentalists who were asked by William Jennings Bryan to come down and testify for him at the Scopes monkey trial, and none of them that he asked came. So he was kind of left all by himself. And since he did not agree with George Mccready Price, when the questions were asked by Clarence Darrow that was based on the assumption that he did agree with George Mccready Price, he fumbled. He fumbled around. And that's what harmed his reputation during the Scopes monkey trial. Because until then, he had a sterling reputation among most Americans as a clear thinker and as a great advocate for the people, a populist. And but he stumbled around because he wasn't really prepared himself. He was not enough of a creationist to answer some of the questions that Darrow asked. Now let me tell you about the Scopes monkey trial. How many of you have heard about the Scopes monkey trial? How many of you have seen the film Inherit the Wind? Okay, Inherit the Wind is a kind of a cultural artifact. It was a play written in response to the Scopes monkey trial, but it was a play written not really to tell you the history of the Scopes monkey trial, because it does not. If you read or you see Inherit the Wind produced, you will not know very much about the Scopes monkey trial because it is a work of fiction. But it's a work of fiction to try to undergird freedom of expression and freedom of thought and so forth. If you're going to understand about the Scopes monkey trial, you need to go to some other better historical records. What happened in the Scopes monkey trial was that a law was passed in Tennessee forbidding the teaching of evolution in public schools. There were 4 states in which that occurred: Oklahoma, Tennessee, Mississippi, and Arkansas. Now, Tennessee's law passed and was signed by the governor, even though the governor did not want to sign it. But he signed it under the impression that it would have no effect. Well, the problem was he wasn't keeping in mind that there was an organization in America called the American Civil Liberties Union. The American Civil Liberties Union immediately picked Tennessee as the place where they wanted to challenge these laws. It was still illegal to teach evolution in Tennessee up until 1968, and this was 1925. So the ACLU wanted to challenge these laws. So they sent out, through advertisement, they advertised for a teacher who would volunteer to be the defendant in a trial testing the anti-evolutionary law. Well, the good old boys of Dayton, Tennessee were sitting around in their coffee shop, as they do, every morning. They get up at 6 o'clock, they go down to the coffee shop, and they sit around and shoot the bull until it's time for them to go to work in their shop or their whatever it was. It was the local pharmacy. And they heard about this challenge of the ACLU to find somebody to teach evolution. Well, they didn't know if anybody in Dayton, Tennessee taught evolution. And as a matter of historical fact, there had not been anybody in Dayton, Tennessee that had taught the theory of evolution. And so One of the good old boys that was sitting around the table was a teacher named John Scopes. And John Scopes was asked if he would teach the theory of evolution in school so that Dayton, Tennessee could get this trial. Scopes agreed. And then, of course, he was indicted. Now, the purpose for this trial, as far as the Dayton, Tennessee people were concerned, was the same purpose as any Chamber of Commerce wants some big event in a city. After it took place, they regretted having done it. But that was the primary reason why they did it, because probably most of them didn't like the theory of evolution. But they also wanted a big event to take place in Dayton, Tennessee, and this was certainly a big event. It was the first event that was transmitted live across the Atlantic, for instance, by wire. And reporters from all over the country, Baltimore, Chicago, every place showed up. William Jennings Bryan heard about it, and this was kind of the culmination of his anti-evolution crusade. If he could just go down there and defend the people of Tennessee against this teacher who was trying to teach their children that they came from apes. So William Jennings Bryan agreed to come. Clarence Darrow couldn't stand being away from this event because William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow were kind of the two most famous lawyers in the United States at the time. And Clarence Darrow was not exactly a popular lawyer, but he certainly was an effective lawyer and a very famous one. So Clarence Darrow eventually, after a great deal of infighting, got to be the lawyer in defense of John Scopes. So that's how the trial was set up. William Jennings Bryan made a mistake in trying to do it because he couldn't get any of his fellow fundamentalists to come testify because they didn't believe in as much in the cause as he did, and because also they didn't want particularly to get involved in this controversy. Most fundamentalists were interested in saving souls. They weren't interested in carrying on any populist movement like William Jennings Bryan was. And so William Jennings Bryan made several mistakes, one of which was that he agreed to be questioned by Clarence Darrow. And Clarence Darrow turned him every which way but loose. Not because Clarence Darrow was necessarily more intelligent than William Jennings Bryan, but because William Jennings Bryan was in an uncomfortable position, because he was expected to defend ideas that he himself did not hold to. William Jennings Bryan died not very long after the Scopes monkey trial, and most interpreters assume that the Scopes monkey trial had a great deal to do with his death, though probably the main thing was that he ate too much. So that's the Scopes monkey trial. Clarence Darrow was not attempting, as the ACLU may have been, was not attempting to get evolution taught in public schools solely. Clarence Darrow, as far as Clarence Darrow was concerned, creationism could be taught right alongside evolution, because he was at one point in the history of this debate. That point was that there were laws in Tennessee and Arkansas and Mississippi against the teaching of evolution, and he just wanted those laws to be done away with. He didn't care if, after that law was done away with, people still taught creationism in public schools, because they were their schools and they had a right to decide what was taught in them. But the position that later developed after Henry Morris began his work was that creationism should not even be taught in public schools in science courses. And so that's what I was saying the other day when I said that, in a sense, fundamentalism shot itself in the foot with Henry Morris. Henry Morris shot fundamentalism in the foot And that is unfortunate because Henry Morris represents just a small part of fundamentalism, certainly of fundamentalist scholars and theologians. Okay, do you have any question about that little history? Yes.
I'm wondering if probably since that time, probably gradually creationism was probably removed a lot from the teaching. I'm wondering if that has to do with it seems like most states have got statewide textbook decision making instead of being done on a local basis. I'm wondering if gradually, because of things like that, creationism was pretty much had disappeared from the teaching.
No, it hadn't. In fact, creationism has disappeared much more rapidly since Henry Morris and other people wrote these laws and tried to get them passed through court, because it really wasn't a very practical effort. It was more of an ideological effort, because until these laws were thrown out as unconstitutional, most school districts were free to do whatever they want to in that regard. It's only after these laws are thrown out that it becomes kind of public policy to try to keep the teaching of creationism out of public schools. And not only that, but a great many people, particularly out in local districts all over the country, their biology was taught by creationists. And so that still goes on. And every once in a while, a reporter finds a person somewhere in Oregon or in Wyoming or Kansas or someplace who is a biology teacher, the only one in the school, and he's a creationist. And so they go with their cameras and follow him around, and then it becomes an issue for the school board. And sometimes the guy gets disciplined, and sometimes he doesn't. But the problem with the constitutional problem, the legal problem, is that just because you defeat the law in Arkansas or Louisiana doesn't mean that you have squelched the teaching of creationism in public schools, because what you have to do, if you're going to be consistent, is to prosecute everybody who continues to do it. And there are a lot of people who continue to do it as a matter of principle. If they're not just creationists who believe that that's the only truth, they at least argue that creationism should be presented if we have any kind of intellectual freedom in our schools. Or they will argue creationism should be presented because our public schools belong to the public, and if you're in a community where most people believe that teaching evolution alone is an attack on their faith, then the local school has the right in the American system to determine whether creationism can be taught also. And in fact, in a sense, evolutionists have shot themselves in the foot too because of this court debate, because there is probably right now, more evolutionary feeling, anti-evolutionary feeling in local school boards around the country, and even on state school boards around the country, than there was before these laws were knocked out. And so, whereas before the laws were attempts to get equal time for evolution and creation, since the creationists did not get equal time, since those laws were knocked out, they are now working on local school boards, sometimes not to get equal time, but sometimes to actually have the teaching of evolution diluted. So there's been some regression in both camps. But the other issue is that the state school boards decide what textbooks are going to be used. And for instance, in the state of Texas, even though there is no law against teaching evolution, the state school board determines which textbooks are used in the state. And the Texas State School Board has been under the strong influence of one fundamentalist couple for decades. And that is a real problem for evolutionists, because when Texas adopts a book, that means that it's going to be adopted by a large number of people, because Texas is is one of the biggest book buyers. And a publisher cannot publish a book for Texas and then publish a book for other people. Or at least to modify the book for everybody else. And so the decision by the Texas State School Board has had a great deal of impact for the last 2 or 3 decades on what textbook is used. Now, there's no textbook, I think, that is used by a state school board that does not include some teaching of evolution. But local teachers really have the privilege of making a decision as to how thoroughly you teach it and how much you go into it. And up until recently, they also had the privilege, since the ACLU wasn't in court, they had the privilege of stating their own opinions about it. So the issue is very muddled these days because of those court cases, whereas there was more freedom for both sides before. If you get into a local school board case, as you can tell from some of these cases that have come from Santa Fe having to do with school prayer and so forth, you're getting into a hornet's nest, because whether they're in a small town in Texas or a small town in Kansas or Wyoming or wherever they are, lots of people have the idea that these are their schools and that these are their children. And so whether you like what they believe or not, they like what they believe. And whether it is technically unconstitutional or not, that's going to have to be fought out in courts, because that's not obvious to them. It's not obvious to them that they can't curtail the teaching of a particular idea. It's not obvious to them that they can't introduce the teaching of another idea which is very valuable to them. And so you have these very virulent court cases coming out of these small towns having to do with prayer. But evolution is one of the hidden agendas there. Anyway, any other comment or question? So there's several levels upon which this issue is. We're talking primarily about the intellectual level, about the scholarly level, the theological level, the philosophical level. But there's also just flat a political level. And the politics is involved in our education system. And the teaching of evolution in public schools has created, and the taking of prayer out of public schools, has created the most extensive private school and homeschooling system in our history. And there are new private schools being built every few years in Houston. Now, that is not making a huge dent in the public school system, but it's certainly a kind of an escape valve for people who have the wherewithal to send their children to private schools. And so a great many people who have been fighting the battle in public schools have just basically given that up and are sending their children to private schools. So Brian fought against what he considered to be the paralyzing influence of the theory of evolution, but he was not tied to Price, nor was he tied to flood geology. But meanwhile, actually decades later, flood geology in the 60s got a reprieve, because a man named Henry Morris and another man named John Whitcomb put out a book in the early 60s called The Genesis Flood. Now you say, what has that got to do with creation? Well, if your whole view of creation is based on your interpretation of the Genesis flood, it has quite a bit to do with creation. And so the Genesis flood was a well-written book. Again, you're not dealing with idiots when you're dealing with scientific creationists. Just before Henry Morris wrote his book on the Genesis flood, he had been a teacher at Rice Institute. And that gave him probably more confidence than he deserved. But he certainly believed that if he were a scientist who had taught at Rice Institute, he had the right to express his views on science in a publication. And so it was a very well done publication. And it hit the presses when I was in college, and it was sold in Christian bookstores, college bookstores, seminary bookstores, all over the place. And so it made quite an impression. And what it did was create more flood geologist creationists than had ever existed before. But again, this is a recent movement. But it has had an impact. Whereas this movement of flood geology was a very minority movement within fundamentalism before Morris and Whitcomb, flood geology has been accepted not only in the United States but worldwide by a large number of fundamentalist people. Numbers refers to some surveys, one done in 1929 and one done in 1982. In 1929, people were asked, do you believe that the creation of the world occurred in the manner and time recorded in Genesis? 89% of Lutherans, the largest number of scientific creationists were Lutherans. 89%. Baptists, 63%. Evangelicals, 62%. Now, if you're talking about 48% of a fundamentalist church answering no to this question, that's a pretty significant group of people in 1929. Presbyterians, 35%. Methodist, 24%. Congregational, 12%. Episcopalian, 11%. So you can see the descending order of how much impact creationism had in 1929. But even in the largest impact, that is upon Lutherans, it's still 89%, which is very high. But among Baptists, it's only 63%. Among Presbyterians, 35%. Now, the fact of the matter is, however, that in 1982 another survey was made which indicates that scientific creationism has grown in its influence in the American populace as a whole. And that in most surveys, if not a majority, almost a majority of Americans of all kinds, believe that some form of creationism should be taught in public schools. And so the only thing that has kept it out of public schools have been the courts. So you can see that there's still a large sociological, political, educational problem having to do with this. Okay, any reaction or comments?
So if the flood is able to, or the Genesis flood is able to be disproved as far as a worldwide flood, then those with flood geology creation really don't have any thesis or theory to stand on if it's just a regional flood.
Well, yeah, that's true. But the problem for flood geologists is not that the universal flood cannot be disproved. The problem for flood geologists is that that flood geology is simply bad science. It just denies the evidence of geology in fossils, at least in terms of length of time. Because you remember, Henry Morris and Whitcomb do not allow more than 6,000 years or so for the Earth to be in existence. At the most, they may allow 10,000 years. Well, that is the chief problem with scientific creationism, is the time problem. Not the evolution, but the time problem. And they have to spend a great deal of their time arguing that all of the fossils are contemporaneous, and that human beings have only been around 6,000 years, and that all other creatures have only been around 6,000 years. And sometimes they have to then go from there to try to prove that dinosaurs have been around since human beings have been around. Well, that's something the old fundamentalists didn't have to argue. And they have to argue that all of the evidence for the flood is enough evidence to get rid of any need for a long period of time, because the flood answers the question as to why the fossils are situated as they are. The flood answers the question as to why there are fish located on the top of mountains, fish fossils on the top of mountains. The flood tells you why there are mountains, why there's the Grand Canyon, and so on and so forth. And so this is a magic formula, the flood. And one of the problems George Mccready Price had is that since he was not a scientist himself, he spent most of his life finding finding young Seventh-day Adventists who were bright and who could be scientists, and sent them to study science. Guess what problem he had? He lost every one of them. In other words, he would send them off to get their education, and right in the middle of their education, they would realize that they could not support George Mccready Price's position, particularly on the time. You know, they would still be fundamentalists, and they would still have a difficult problem with evolution and with what it implied about the nature of man, but they just couldn't keep with flood geology. So flood geology is really the biggest problem with Henry Morris, and it's the biggest problem that scientists have with scientific creationism. That's the reason why we need to distinguish between this form and some other fundamentalist and evangelical ways of dealing with it, because there are some evangelicals who are what can be called theistic evolutionists, and Henry Morris and folks like them consider them to be just as atheistic as somebody who doesn't believe in God. At least they're toying with atheism, and they're too stupid to understand, or too uneducated to understand, that the implications of their beliefs are disastrous for their young children and the young people in the church and so forth. Yeah.
Is there really any evidence that there's an increase in number of people who actually believe in a young Earth, though? I mean, which, you know, the flood geology obviously
well, there was
supports.
certainly an increase in the number of people who believed in young Earth after the Genesis flood was published, and there's probably been an increase since the court cases, because those are the things since the prayer in public schools case, since the Bible reading in public school case, and since the court cases having to do with Arkansas and Louisiana. Those things put things in the public light. And so the people who are the chief antagonists of science, or the scientific theory of evolution, then have a platform from which to speak. And if they convinced enough people, and it's easy to convince people who have never given any thought to it at all, but who are very conservative about the Bible and very conservative about their view of Jesus and human nature. It's not hard to convince them with just one little lecture that the church holds to accept this view. because the argument is made, if you give up a 24-hour creation day, then God is lying. Well, even if you didn't believe that before, if somebody tells you that your soul depends on believing that, then there are going to be some converts. Now, it's gone the other direction among scholars, among evangelical scholars. Among evangelical scholars, there are less creationists. There are less scientific creationists. All evangelical scholars are creationists in the wider sense. But among evangelical scholars, there are less creationists. But among the local churches, you can read in the paper just about every few weeks about a seminar by scientific creationists in a local church in Houston. And the other thing, which I mentioned before, that contributes to this problem, is that there is a great deal of sympathy and empathy on the part of the public at large, who are not scientific creationists, for the position of scientific creationists. That is, even if you don't believe everything they believe about flood geology, they still have a right to protect their children from a position which challenges that, by at least providing equal time. Sometimes release time has been tried in various places, and release time meant that you had a school system where you had a great many Catholics or a great many fundamentalists, and they wanted time during the school day for their minister to come in and teach something on Christianity, and quite often it would have to do with creation or something like that. And there were several release time experiments around the country. Eventually those were declared unconstitutional and died out. But every time something is declared unconstitutional, there's always the possibility of going back to your room and rewriting the law so that it does not fall under the strictures that the judge has used in getting rid of this law. And that's what happened in Louisiana. That's what happened in Arkansas. New laws were written in the light of the failures that had taken place before. But since the failure of the Arkansas and Louisiana laws, primarily the fight has gone to the local level. And if you're a school board in a small town, and you have a whole room full of people who just do not accept court decision on something, you're in a pickle. Now, what I want to do the rest of this class, which is not very long, and then again when we take up the subject, is to talk about a new movement which is really taking the place of scientific creationism among evangelicals, because it is a movement that is being offered by scholars who are much better educated scientists, much better educated theologically, much better educated philosophically. They are not going to the Bible and trying to prove that the world was created in 24-hour days or that it was created just a few thousand years ago. These people generally accept that the world is, or that the universe is 14 billion years old and that the world is so many million years old. They generally accept that. Many of them also generally accept that there's been some evolutionary development. They don't believe, many of them, that evolution, that any particular theory of evolution now in existence is the final theory. But they don't fight the idea that perhaps there's evolutionary development. But what they're now saying is that the argument from design was too hastily given up, and that it's quite possible to still argue for design. And this is the view that is causing so much problem for modern scientists. And when I read the books that many modern scientists are writing about the design movement, they are obviously not well read in the design movement because they equate it with Henry Morris's movement. They say, well, this is just a new form of scientific creationism. Well, as long as they simply equate it with Henry Morris's movement, which is not even representative of the best thinking of fundamentalists at the turn of the century, then they're not really prepared to deal with it. So what I'm going to do is to talk about the design movement that was originated, the modern design movement, by, for instance, a man named Michael Behe. He's the associate professor of biochemistry at the Department of Biological Sciences at Lehigh University. And he has published a book entitled Darwin's Black Box. And Darwin's Black Box has landed like a bombshell. People are acquainted with what he has done, even if they have not themselves personally studied it. And they're assuming that what he has done is basically the same thing that Henry Morris tried to do, and that is introduce the Bible, our theology, into science. And that may be true. In other words, I'm not going to argue that their analysis of that is incorrect. But that is certainly not what Behe thinks he's doing, and that's certainly not what Dembski thinks he's doing. They believe that they are working specifically from science, just like the old scientists at the time of Darwin. They believe they're working from science, and they're not trying to present any particular theological presupposition or any particular biblical interpretation. They're just saying, if you look at science, if you look at the facts of science, there are too many things about the facts of science that point you toward design to completely give up any concept of design. Charles Darwin himself said, and this is what Behe, this is where Behe goes from. If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. What Behe says is, guess what? There are complex organisms that exist that could not have possibly been formed by numerous successive slight modifications. Therefore, Darwin's theory breaks down. An irreducibly complex biological system, if there is such a thing, would be a powerful challenge to Darwinian evolution. Now again, the reason why Behe and Dembski are so powerful in their attack is because they are not arguing that there has not been evolution. They're just arguing that all present orthodox theories of evolution tend to presuppose naturalism. And that is not scientific. So what they're saying is evolution may be something that everyone, including Christians, has to accept, but no particular orthodox theory of evolution that tends toward naturalism necessarily is acceptable. Now, this is a picture of what Behe thinks is a irreducibly complex organism. This is the flagellum of a bacterium. Now, if you mean a single system composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, wherein the removal of any one of the parts causes the system to effectively cease functioning, then you're talking about an irreducibly complex system. Now think about that again. An irreducibly complex system is a single system composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, wherein the removal of any one of the parts causes the system to effectively cease functioning. Now, the old creationists used to argue irreducible complexity too, but they didn't generally use that term. What these modern design people have picked up on is Darwin's own language, Darwin's own suggestion that if there is an irreducibly complex system, then his theory is in trouble. So what Behe has done, since he is a scientist, is to produce models of what he considers to be irreducibly complex things. An irreducibly complex system cannot be produced directly, that is, by continuously improving the initial function, which continues to work by the same mechanism, by slight successive modifications of a precursor system, because any precursor to an irreducibly complex system that is missing a part is by definition non-functional. Now, no analogy is really airtight, but one of the simplest analogies to Behe's conception of an irreducibly complex system is a mousetrap. Now imagine the way a mousetrap is designed. It's a very simple mechanism, but if any part of it was missing, there would be no mousetrap. You get that picture? If any part of a mousetrap is missing, there would be no mousetrap. So there is no doubt in the mind of anybody. You remember Paley's argument about the watch. There's no doubt in the mind of anybody that a mousetrap has to be designed. Not only does it have to be designed, but it has to be manufactured in accordance with that design. And after you're an hour into the manufacture of this thing, you may have the platform, the board platform upon which it is based. You do not have a mousetrap. If you spend another hour manufacturing another part, then you have the spring mechanism and the trap itself. But even that won't work until you have the little stick that goes under, that is the trigger. So what he's saying is, if you look at a mousetrap and you see the parts of a very simple instrument, and you realize that without any one of those parts you would not have a mousetrap, then it seems extremely unlikely that something as complicated as this, as even a bacterium, could have developed over time, because what would have caused this development? What would have designed it? And how would this thing have worked if even one part had not yet been produced by a variation? Well, the only evolutionary argument to that is time. In other words, the idea is that there has simply been enough time for anything to have happened. Now, in order to answer Behe and some of the other design people, some modern evolutionists have realized that they've had to go to a even a different understanding of how long time is, and gone to the idea of multiple universes. But and so the point is that Behe and Dembski are not going to be able to produce any evidence to convince a great many evolutionary biologists that they have shown that there's design. Because whenever they make a little bit of progress, then of course the scientists can go in some other direction and find out why there is a possibility or a hypothesis that there's much more time available than what we thought. And so that's what produces the fire in this discussion that's going on right now, because Behe is producing models which the scientific creationists were not able to produce. They didn't know enough to produce them. Yes?
That's just the tail of the organism, right?
Yeah.
Flagellum.
That's just the tail of the organism. The fact of the matter is that without the tail operating, there would not be this bacterium. Okay? So if you look at the tail and what it's connected to, and all of the intricacies of the connection that are necessary in order for that tail to work, then you've got what Behe calls an irresistibly complex mechanism. Irreducibly complex mechanism.
So would Behe be suggesting that the bacteria was specially created?
Well, he's not necessarily suggesting that. If you mean by special creation that it's an instantaneous kind of thing. What he is suggesting is, however that bacterium came into existence, somehow behind it is a designer. Because whatever variations took place, whatever selection took place, had to have as its goal the production of this kind of mechanism. Because this kind of mechanism could not happen by chance. You know, that's the simple argument. That's the argument that goes all the way back to Thomas Aquinas and to Aristotle. But it's more refined an argument, since it's not merely a philosophical argument anymore. It is an argument based on actual entities, namely the bacteria.
Natural selection couldn't produce something such as this?
Well, Behe says, how could it? In other words, he's putting a challenge to evolutionists to show how it could. If you believe in Darwin's theory of evolution, then you have to believe that there is enough variation, enough selection, and enough genetic mutation and so forth that takes place in the amount of time that we have available to have produced all kinds of possibilities to such a complexity that eventually a bacterium could develop that has all of these mechanisms that have to work together at the same time. The old William Jennings Bryan, for instance, would have thrown out the issue of an eyeball. But Behe's not going to an eyeball. He's going to things that are even more complex. This is the way the old creationists thought evolution worked. According to the evolution, a mole developed on an organism. And when the mole came in contact with the sun irritated it. And out of that irritation of that mole, eventually developed an eyeball, which is so complex that without one part of it, it couldn't see. So what the design people are saying is, how can you assume that anything exists that does something as complex as seeing and requires all of these elements in order for it to work? And if one element doesn't work, you're blind. If one element in an eye doesn't work, you're blind. How could that have happened by chance? Now, evolutionists believe they have an answer to that.
Trial and error?
Yeah. Trial and error and time. The biggest problem now is time, because even mathematicians who are evolutionists are pointing out that with Darwin's theory of evolution, there's just not enough time for things to have happened. And Jay Gould has accepted that. And so he is working on a variation of Darwin's theory of evolution. But what these design people are saying is, even the modern variations on Darwinism don't give you enough time. And so when we get back to this issue, what we're going to do is to show that modern evolutionists agree that it looks like the world is designed. But since there is no God, it is not designed. And so here are some alternatives. So that's the debate that's going on at the present time. And we'll take that up next time.
Time is the debate, correct?
Next time is debate, yeah. I'm talking about the next time we have a class.